Imagine a system of government, a way of life that lasts for millennia. It's the very bedrock of a civilization. And then, in the span of just a few short months, poof, it's gone. That's the incredible story of the 1911 revolution in China, and we're going to dive into how the world's longest ruling political system came to such a sudden, shocking end.
Think about this for a second. For over 2,000 years, China was ruled by emperors, one imperial dynasty after another. The emperor, the son of heaven, was the absolute center of everything: politics, society, you name it. This system had survived countless rebellions, invasions, and disasters. It just seemed permanent, unshakable. And yet, by 1912, it was all over. A republic was declared, and the age of emperors was just finished. So this brings us to the central question for this whole explainer. How on earth did a 2,000-year-old imperial structure just completely collapse so fast?
All right, our story has to start with China's final dynasty, the Qing. By the time we get to the turn of the 20th century, the Qing Empire was in some serious trouble. It was kind of like a magnificent old building, but its foundations were rotting from the inside out, and there was a hurricane raging outside.
This right here captures the total paralysis at the very top. On one side, you had these reformers who actually convinced the young emperor to launch this thing called the 100 Days Reform to try and modernize the country. But on the other side, you had the real power, Empress Dowager Cixi and her conservative crew, and they saw all this change as a threat. So they just crushed the movement, put the emperor under house arrest, and basically proved that real change was not going to come from the top.
So this table kind of lays out the three competing visions for what China should be. You had the monarchists who were desperately clinging to power. Then you had the reformers who were thinking, hey, maybe we can save this thing by turning it into a modern constitutional monarchy, like they did in Japan. And then you had the revolutionaries, guys like Sun Yat-sen, who believed the entire imperial system was rotten to the core and needed to be torn down. With goals that are so completely opposed, you just know a major collision is coming. On top of all this internal weakness, the Qing were facing a perfect storm of pressure from the outside and from within. Seriously, the best way to think about it is like a Jenga tower. You've got foreign powers and local opponents just pulling out blocks, one by one, making the whole thing dangerously wobbly. And a huge part of this pressure was coming from abroad. Starting with things like the Opium Wars, foreign powers used their superior military might to just beat the Qing armies and then force them to sign what became known as the unequal treaties. And let's be clear, these were not negotiations. These were demands made at gunpoint that just chipped away at China's ability to rule itself.
The Convention of Peking in 1860 is just a brutal example of this humiliation. Look at these terms. China was forced to give up land, open more cities to foreign control, and even legalize the opium trade that was devastating the country. Every single treaty like this just eroded the government's authority and made people furious at both the foreigners and the Qing.
Meanwhile, the opposition inside China was also completely split. You've got the reformers trying to save the dynasty, and the revolutionaries dead set on destroying it. Their goals couldn't be more different. And get this, look at the revolutionary slogan. It was explicitly racial, framing the ruling Manchu class not as Chinese, but as foreign barbarians. This deep division meant that nobody really had a unified plan for what came next. They just had a shared enemy.
So after decades of slow rot and all this mounting pressure, you'd think the final collapse would come from some big, coordinated master plan, right? Well, nope. It was triggered by a complete and total accident.
Okay, you have to hear this chain reaction. It's almost comical. First, the government moves a bunch of its best troops out of the city of Wuchang to go deal with the protests somewhere else. This leaves the city, a known hotbed for revolutionaries, pretty much wide open. Then, a group of these revolutionaries are in their hideout making bombs, and they accidentally set one off. Whoops. So the police investigate, and what do they find? They find the membership lists, with the names of all the revolutionary sympathizers in the local army. So for these soldiers, the choice became incredibly simple. Revolt right now or get arrested and executed. On October 10, 1911, they chose to revolt.
That one accidental uprising lit a fuse to a powder keg that was ready to blow. And what's truly mind-boggling is just how fast everything fell apart after that. Look at this timeline. The revolt starts on October 10th. Less than 2 weeks later, a whole province declares independence. Within weeks, the dynasty just evaporates as province after province says, "We're out." The Jenga tower had finally come crashing down.
Okay, so with the empire basically shattering in real time,
the story shifts. It goes from this chaotic rebellion to some very intense backroom political deals. The question wasn't if the dynasty would fall anymore, but what in the world was going to replace it.
In a moment of pure desperation, the Qing court called on the one man who could possibly save them, Yuan Shikai. This guy was a shrewd political operator, and more importantly, he commanded the Beiyang army, which was the dynasty's most modern and powerful military force. He effectively held the fate of the entire empire in his hands.
But Yuan was no fool. He was an opportunist, and he could see which way the wind was blowing. Now, the revolutionaries, led by Sun Yat-sen, they knew they couldn't actually beat Yuan's army on the battlefield. So they made him an incredible offer. Look, we'll make you the first president of the new Republic of China. Sun will step aside. There was just one condition. He had to convince the emperor to abdicate peacefully.
And Yuan took the deal. He went to the imperial court and, let's say, persuaded them that the game was up. And so, on February 12, 1912, the last emperor of China, a 6-year-old boy, formally abdicated. Think about that. Over 2,000 years of imperial rule didn't end with some glorious last stand or epic battle. It ended with the stroke of a pen in a quiet room in the Forbidden City.
So that's it, right? Revolution's a success, the emperor is gone, a new republic is born, and a modern, democratic China begins. Everybody lives happily ever after. Well, not quite. The story definitely doesn't end there. You see, the end of the empire wasn't the end of China's troubles. In a lot of ways, it was actually the beginning of a brand new, even more chaotic chapter. The revolution was far from finished. Remember Yuan Shikai, the guy who was supposed to be the republic's first president? Yeah, he had no real belief in Republican ideals. In 1915, he flat out betrayed the revolution and declared himself emperor. The move was a disaster, super unpopular, and it failed. But when Yuan died just a year later, the country shattered. With no strong leader at the center, China completely collapsed into decades of brutal civil war that we now call the warlord era.
And this is exactly why this piece of history from over a century ago is still so incredibly important today. The fall of the Qing kicked off this long, painful search for a new Chinese identity. The power vacuum it created set the stage perfectly for the rise of the two parties that would fight to control the country's destiny, the nationalists and the communists. And even now, both the government in Beijing and the government in Taiwan trace their origins back to this moment, with each one claiming to be the true heir of the 1911 revolution.
So in the end, the 1911 revolution didn't really create a single stable nation. It created a question that still shapes global politics to this very day. What is China, and who gets to decide its future? And that leaves us with one final thought to chew on. How does the legacy of one single revolution continue to define the fate of two different nations?